you stand for the gospel reading? So today is the third Sunday, so it'll be an extended homily, question, answer, discussion stuff. And I've chosen as the theme for the homily, the Our Father. So today what I did, I took 4 different versions of the Our Father. One in Latin to remind us of the days before Vatican II, and then 3 English versions, which they give you different insights into this prayer. So the first one, for the oldies among us, the Latin version, and feel free to join in if you remember it. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. And Matthew's version, Matthew and Luke have very, very different versions of the Our Father, but then it's compounded by the different translations. So this is a translation of Matthew's Gospel it's called the New English Version. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And then Luke is a very, very different version of the Our Father from Matthew. And this is a translation called the New Revised Standard Version. Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everybody indebted to us. And do not bring us to the time of trial. And finally, this was a version that I wrote for the Children's Mass several years ago. God, you are our Father and our Mother. You live in heaven. May all people respect your name. Help us to behave here on earth the way people behave in heaven. Help us to make sure that every creature has enough food today, and let us experience your unconditional love so that we can love each other unconditionally. Help us not to give in to bad suggestions, but instead to turn our faces to the light. Words inspired by God. You don't have to be a mechanic to drive a car. But it must be a lot more fun if you are a mechanic and you're driving your car. So most of us, certainly myself, I try to ignore any lights I see on the dashboard, that I didn't see when I started driving. And I try to ignore any sounds I hear, as I'm driving. When I drive with my brother Seán, it's a totally different experience. Totally different experience. He's like a mother with an infant baby. Every single gurgle or sound or anything that's off, he hears it, and he's diagnosing it, and he's trying to rectify it, like a mother with a little infant. I ignore any sounds I hear. I ignore any flashing lights until I get to some place where I can ask somebody who knows something about it what the flashing light means. Meanwhile, I've run out of oil or something. You don't have to be a software scientist in order to use a computer. But it must be a whole lot more fun if you are a software scientist, because you can get so much more out of your computer than the rest of us. If you're a dumb Loomis, it's a very different experience from being a Seán ÓLaoire when you're in front of your computer. Don can do things with his computer that I couldn't even think or dream about. So it must be a whole much more fun for Don to be in front of his computer than for me to be in front of my computer. You don't have to be a linguist in order to learn how to speak. Every single one of us has learned how to speak. But it must be a whole much more fun if you were a linguist to be able to look at the deep structure of language and understand, how they cross-fertilize with each other, or what the origin of languages have been, or how to dig deep into vocabulary or grammatical structure, or whatever, to be able to identify an alveolar fricative that most of us have never even heard of, or a bilabial consonant. Nobody has heard about it. So my favorite linguist of all is a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure, and he's probably the most important linguist of the 20th century. He was a Swiss linguist. And he was the person who identified that in spoken language there are three very significant parts. So if you're in the bush in East Africa, and all of a sudden you see this huge big creature with these long legs and this long neck, and you're looking at it, and you're listening to it, and you're hearing, you can even smell it, and you record it somehow in your brain. And then you come home, and you begin to tell Evelyn, here, this is what I saw when I was walking in the bush. So he says there are three very different components. There's the actual thing in the real world, and he called it the referent, what you're referring to. And then there's the image you make in your mind. He called that the signified, and that image can be a visual image, or it can be an auditory image if you heard it making noise, or it could be an olfactory image, or if you reached out and touched it, it could be a tactile image. So you've got all these images recorded in your mind. He called that the signified. So it signified the referent. And then when I'm telling Evelyn about it, I'm using words of various kinds. And depending on what language we're using, I'm going to use different signifiers. If I'm using Swahili, I'm going to call it twiga. If I'm using English, I'm going to call it a giraffe. And so there's the signifiers are the symbols we use to exchange or communicate the signified ideas in the head because of the real life thing that we've seen. So language is this really beautiful, complex phenomenon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that before I get into the subject of the Our Father this morning. So I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about sound itself, sound as a creative force, in my first point. And then secondly, sound as a healing energy. Then thirdly, sound as revelation. Then fourthly, the difficulty we have when we translate from one language to another. And then fifthly, using all those, I'm going to have a look at the Our Father and see if I can kind of tease it asunder a little bit. So firstly, sound as a creative force. And I've talked about this many times. That, for instance, in Sanskrit, there's a belief system in Sanskrit that the consonants and the vowels of this language, which was developed by the rishis, the ancient wise ones, and what they claim is that when you're speaking Sanskrit, the vowels and the consonants you're using are not signifiers. They're not symbols of something in the real world. They're actually creating the referent in the real world. So when you speak in Sanskrit, the belief system is you're actually creating the reference. You're not using just signifiers to kind of translate the signified in your head about the thing you actually saw before. You're actually creating it. Now, the New Testament says the same thing. The prologue to John's Gospel makes exactly the same claim. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were created through it, and without it was created nothing that was created. And the Word became flesh. So in some senses, this extraordinary Word, the Word of God, was the thing that brought everything into being. So word or sound in that sense is this extraordinary creative force. Now, other people's got the same idea. The Aborigines of Australia had the very same idea. They believed that it was the songs sung by the ancestors that created the mountain or the stream or the valley. And so every mountain, every stream, every valley had a song and music attached to it. And you would never engage with it. You would never try to cross a river or, climb a mountain whose music you didn't understand. You had to know the music of it and to enter into it. But it was the music or the sound that actually brought it into being in the first place. So that's my first point. That sound is this extraordinary creative force. It brings into being that which did not previously exist. Second point I want to make is this. Sound as a healing energy. So sounds sometimes have a cognitive import or a mental or intellectual construct. So if I tell you, for instance, today is Sunday morning and it's 10 past 10 in Palo Alto. Now, you're unpacking that as an intellectual statement. It's giving you information about the date and about the time. So it's a kind of a cognitive or a mental or an intellectual appreciation of the sounds that I'm making. But there's a whole other side to sound, and that's the kind of the vibration or the frequency that it sends out there. And sometimes there's no cognitive meaning whatsoever to sounds we make, but they're very, very effective. You take a young mother who's singing a lullaby to her child. She's making all of these nonsense syllables. If you were trying to understand what she's saying, you would have no idea what they mean. They don't mean anything. But the effect is extraordinary. Not only is it soothing the mother, it's soothing the baby as well. So there's a vibratory level to sound, quite apart altogether from its intellectual, cognitive aspect, which may be even more important than the cognitive aspect. Studies have shown that mothers all over the world, they make sounds in particular pitches and tones and cadences and volumes which say exactly what the baby needs to hear in order to calm down in any situation. So how do mothers know this? So these, if you were listening to any of these and you spoke the local language, they wouldn't make any sense to you. So mothers make up these tunes and these sounds that have this extraordinary healing and soothing ability. So sound is not just about making sense. Some of the most important sounds don't make sense, but they're really, really, really effective. I have a theory, for instance, that when somebody is moaning, you could say, oh, that's an indication they're in pain, or it's a cry for help. They want some help because they're in distress of some kind. They're parenthetical to it. The reason the person is moaning is that the person instinctively knows to create a kind of vibration that's actually healing themselves. So I have a theory that the future of real medicine, at some stage we'll discover that the most healing thing you can do, the most healing intervention of all, is, I'm going to call it directed sound therapy. I believe that every organ in the body has its own frequency, its own vibratory rate. And when it's really, really healthy, it's vibrating and making music in a particular frequency. When it's out of kilter because of food or toxins in the environment or a distressing situation, it creates a totally different frequency that makes for ill health. So I'm convinced that at some stage we'll discover that every organ has a specific frequency, and we'll direct that frequency specifically, deliver it to the specific organ to bring it back into its pristine balance, and that is how we will re-achieve our health. So in some senses, I see the organism, the human body, like an orchestra with different sections. There's the percussion section, and there's the string section, and there's the wind section. What's the fourth section, Nancy? Horns. Like horns, yeah. So it's 4 different sections. So each organ is like a different section. And you're the musician. And what do you need to do? There's 3 things you need to do. Yeah, you need firstly to produce the ideal sound from the instrument that you're in charge of. Whether it's a fiddle or it's a drum, whatever it is. You have to produce the ideal pitch of sound. The second thing is you have to harmonize with the other sections, the woodwind or whatever, so that they're all, harmonized together. And thirdly, you have to look at the baton of the conductor to make sure everybody is in sync. That's what the entire organism is doing if it's really, really healthy. Every organ in the body is producing the exact right frequency and is listening to the other organs and is watching what the conductor is doing, and then you've got a really healthy body. So I believe that that's where medicine is going to go in the future. That's my second point. My third point is, I think that sound is revelatory. It is revelation. Sound is revelation. So, for instance, if creation is God enfleshed, according to John's Gospel, the Word became flesh. So everything we see about us, the entire cosmos, is an incarnation of the sound that God made. So creation or incarnation is actually God enfleshed. You look at Revelation, and I think that Revelation is God enstoried. That God tells stories, and the story is the revelation, whether it's in a written form or a verbalized form. Initially, obviously, it was an oral tradition. So in some senses, all of Revelation is God enstoried. Now, the interesting thing is the Quran makes that claim. The Holy Quran, the sacred book of Islam, claims that, the revelation of the Quran is not in the written word. You cannot read the Quran and extract revelation from it, because it is not a cognitive encounter. You're not meeting ideas in the Quran. It has to be chanted in Arabic, according to Islam, because it is in the sound of the words that the revelation is contained. So you can't translate the Quran, and you certainly can't just be reading it. If somebody is not chanting it in Arabic, The belief system is you're not in touch with the revelation. That the revelation is actually the sounds the words make in the original language, Arabic. So that's the third point. So it's, in some senses, it's the sound that contains the revelation, not the cognitive kind of ideas in it. This brings me to my fourth point. I'm going to look at the difficulty then in moving from language to language. And I'm going to just, when you think of a language, every language is the unique experience of a culture, in their life, how they experience life. So every single language, and there are about 5,000 languages currently on the planet. There were 7,000 at the beginning of the 20th century. We lost almost 2,000 languages in the course of the 20th century. But at the moment, there are about 5,000 languages left. But every language, in fact, languages don't just give you different physical grunts for the same things in the physical universe. It's not like that you look at something and if you're speaking in English, you say, it's a chair. And if you're speaking in Irish, you say, chahir. And if you're speaking Kalenjin, you say, ngecheret. Or you're speaking Swahili, you say, kiti. So you're not making just different grunts for the same stuff, in different languages. That's not what it's about. Every language is actually an entire cosmology. Every language is a unique cultural perspective on their experiences of life. So it becomes really difficult actually to translate from one language to the other. Because a language creates a mindset, it creates a perspective, it creates a map of reality, and it creates an entire cosmology. So if your experiences of life is different from some other culture, how do you translate your ideas into the host language? Sometimes there's no equivalent vocabulary to contain the ideas that you're trying to work with. So it's really, really difficult. It's like trying to measure your height using a weighing machine. A weighing machine is useless if you're trying to measure your height, or trying to use a fork just to drink soup. And so translating from language to language is a really, really difficult process. So typically, as you're translating from one language to the other, you're going to use one of three methodologies that linguists employ. And the first one is literal translation. And you might think that this is obviously the most accurate, to translate literally from one language to the other, using a verb for a verb, a noun for a noun, an adjective for an adjective. But actually you get in really, really big trouble very, very quickly if you try to translate literally. You're losing the meaning completely. Particularly if you're dealing with stuff like, let's say, proverbs. I've used this example with you before. You take a proverb in the original language, and because you've been raised in the language and the culture, the proverb will make sense to you. You translate it into another language, and it's meaningless. You have to go into paroxysms of explanation to try to make the other person understand what it means. So I'll give you an example from Irish. We have a proverb in Irish that says, Is minnig a chur farn a luchrig, farn a slúsad amach. Is minnig a chur farn a luchrig, farn a slúsad amach. Now, if you're raised in Irish, you immediately get what the import of this parable. If I translate it into English, literally it goes like this. 'Tis often the man of the ashes threw the man of the shovel out. 'Tis often the man of the ashes threw the man of the shovel out. Now, what in God's name does that mean? It doesn't make any sense in English. If you're raised in Irish, it makes perfect sense. And what it means is this, that you have a family, small family, a mother, father, and two sons. And the eldest son is daddy's favourite, and he works beside daddy every day. He's out in the field with the shovel, and he's working with the shovel constantly, and he's helping daddy do everything. Meanwhile, the little fella is sitting with mammy at the fireside, and mammy is giving him buns, cookie buns and tea and whatever, and he's got his feet inside in the ashes, and he's nice and toasty. And then it comes, and the old man is about to die, and he's making his will. And the mother persuades the father to give the farm to the little fella. And so he inherits the farm, and he kicks out the guy, the man of the shovel, who's been working all his life with the father. So it is often the man of the ashes kicked the man of the shovel out. It doesn't make any sense in English until you go into this big, big explanation. In Irish, you get it immediately. So you try and translate from one to the other, and you're in big trouble. I've shared this story with you before. I remember one time when I was living in Kenya, and an American priest came visiting. He had donated money to a project, a hospital we were building. So he came to visit and see what was happening, and I invited him to come on a mass safari with me. And I invited him to speak to the people. So he's speaking English, and I'm translating into a language called Kalenjin. And at one stage, he used the phrase, "He pushed my buttons." I had never heard this expression. I had no idea what "he pushed my buttons" meant. I had no idea what it meant. I'm thinking, how the hell am I going to translate this? Now, to complicate things, the people I lived with, they didn't wear buttons. They'd never seen buttons. They had kind of cowhide thongs that they fastened their garments with. So I'm thinking, okay. He pushed my buttons. So, okay. He pressed upon my cowhide thongs. The whole crowd was, what the hell is he talking? I had no idea what I was saying. They had no idea what I was saying. I hope the American, knew what he was saying, but it couldn't get translated. So when you translate literally from one language to the other, you miss a whole bunch of stuff. So it's not the best way to translate. The second way to translate is called, paraphrasing. And paraphrasing is you start with an idea that you want the language to say, and then you translate accordingly. You brutalize the original language in order to have it say what you want it to say. So you make do all kinds of weird stuff. So I remember another case in Kenya. There was a new church being opened, and the apostolic delegate, an Italian guy, big pompous character, was saying the Mass, and he was giving the homily. And there was an African priest called Father George who was translating from English into Swahili. And this prelate was giving the most boring speech I've ever heard in my entire life. I've heard bad priests. This guy was the pits. Absolutely boring. But George was translating, and the crowd were next. They were clapping furiously. And this guy with his mind was thinking, oh my God, I'm doing a brilliant job here. And what was happening? George was giving a totally different homily from what the guy was doing. Had nothing got to do with it. Absolutely nothing got to do with it. And the crowd were in ecstasy, and they're clapping and delighted. And this guy's thinking, well, God, I'm hitting it out of the park this morning. So this happens very frequently with the Bible. When you get fundamentalist Christians translating the Bible, and they got a theology, and they need the Bible to back up their theology. So they're going to translate the original to say what they want it to say. So that's called paraphrasing. That's the second great way of translating from any one language into another. And the third one, and the one obviously that scholars favor, is called dynamic transference. So a scholar, in order to translate, say, from the original, Aramaic or Hebrew or Greek or whatever, they have to do a whole bunch of stuff. They have to be obviously conversant with the language, really conversant with it. They have to know the history of the period. They have to know the culture. They have to know even the coinage, the measuring devices that they're using. They have to steep themselves in all of that. And then they have to ask themselves the questions, what did the original author really want to convey? And how can I get that idea across in the translation? Now, there's still obviously a subjective measure to it, but at least they're trying to very, very faithfully record what they think the original author had in mind. And that's obviously the best way. So you have to go back to the original sources. What happens often is, say, for instance, the Our Father was spoken in Aramaic. Yeah? It's translated into Hebrew. The Hebrew is translated into Greek. The Greek is translated into Latin. And the Latin is translated into the vernaculars. So now you've got 5 levels of translation. And you see what happens as you move from one to the other. So the real scholars will try to go back to the originals, steep themselves in the culture, and then try to understand what did the author really intend saying, and can I represent that as faithfully as possible. So with all that behind us now, I'm going to have a quick look at the Our Father and examine some parts of the Our Father. So I'm going to just mess around for a little bit with a few different languages. A little bit of Aramaic, a little bit of Latin, English, Irish, Swahili and Kalenjin, to give you a flavour for what happens when different languages get in contact with the same prayer. And so, for instance, the first place we run into trouble is all of the other languages, they use a gender-specific noun to represent to whom this prayer is being addressed. Whether you're using Irish or English or Greek or Latin, they're all talking about a male gender progenitor, father, pater, noster, baba yetu in Swahili. It's all father, 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 our father. The Aramaic is different. The original Aramaic in which Jesus spoke has a much subtler meaning to it. The word he used was avon, and avon has a sense of the birthing principle of the cosmos. It wasn't a male progenitor, not a daddy figure. It was the birthing principle of the cosmos, that which brought everything that exists into being. And so the prayer is being addressed not to some guy sitting in the sky with a beard. It's being addressed to the principle that brought all of creation into being to begin with. So it's a very, very different flavour. Even the very first word as you start off, you're having a totally different experience of the prayer if you're not talking to a bearded male, but rather you're talking to a birthing principle of the cosmos. So we get into trouble immediately we start translating right off the bat here. The second word I want to pick up on is the word name. Hallowed be thy name. Now, in many languages, unfortunately, English being among them, a name is just a kind of an identity tag to differentiate Mary from Martha, from Jimmy from Johnny. So a name very often is just a tag we hang on people to kind of differentiate among them. Irish is very different, and Latin is very different. The other languages, they're basically tags we hang on each other. In Irish, the word for name is anam, and it's spelled A-I-N-M, and the word for soul is anam, A-N-A-M, and it's done intentionally because the name in Irish or in Gaelic is a mystical. It's a soul contact. So you got anam and onam. So when you use hallowed be thy name, there's a dance going on in that prayer in Irish that you're not going to get in English, between the soul of God and the name of God. In Latin, you've got the same idea. The Latin word is nomen. And then there's the Latin word numen. And numen, from which you get the English word numinous, means mystical or esoteric. So when you're praying this prayer in Latin, and you say, hallowed be thy name, and you're using nomen, there's nomen and numen, and there's this mystical dance that's going on. The very same thing is true in the Hebrew. In Hebrew, there was no name for God. They were not allowed to name God. In a very famous incident in the book of Exodus in chapter 3, where Moses wants to find out, this God who wants him to go back into Egypt, where Moses is wanted for murder, what am I going to tell them? Who are you? What's your name? And God refuses to divulge his name. What he says in Hebrew, he says, Ehiyeh Ashir Ehiyeh, which is a future tense. It literally means, I will be who I will be. It's often mistranslated into English as, I am who I am, or I am that I am. There's no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am in Hebrew. You have to get around it by what's called a linguistic device called predication without a verb. And the same thing is true in Swahili. So God did not say I am. God said I will be who I will be. So he refused to divulge his name. Because in Hebrew, to know somebody's name is to have some element of power over them. That's why you were told, do not take God's name in vain. They're not talking about just cursing. They're saying, do not pretend that you can grab hold of God, control him, and have him do your will. So Hebrew, there is no name for God. So they will call God, Yud He Vav He, the tetragrammaton. They have 4 letters they use to signify his name. And when they come across the name of God, they'll say the Lord. They won't attempt to pronounce a proper name for God. So when you're praying this prayer in Irish, or you're praying it in Latin, or you're praying in Hebrew, you have a totally different sense of what the word name means than you do, for instance, in English. So you miss all of that in English. Let's go on to the word, the phrase, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Now, originally as a small kid, I learned this in Irish and I learned it in English. So in Irish we say, and in English we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Now this little English word as, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It is radically inadequate to conveying the meaning of that phrase. I didn't understand it until I learned it in Swahili. And in Swahili that phrase says, utusamehe makosa yetu kama vile tunavyowasamehe na wale wanaotukosea. And the key piece is, in the middle of it is, kama tunavyo. And in Swahili that means, in exactly the same fashion. The English word as does not do duty to that. Forgive us as we forgive those. In Swahili it says, forgive us our trespasses in exactly the same way that we forgive those who trespass against us. Now, this is a totally different understanding of forgiveness. And it's not that God is praying quid pro quo and saying, if you don't forgive others, I'm not going to forgive you. He's not saying that. He's saying that to forgive somebody else, you have to open your heart. And if you open your heart to give out love, your heart is open to receive love. If you refuse to forgive, you have to shut down your heart. And if you shut down your heart so that no love escapes to the enemy, no love can come back from your friends. And so God is saying that's how it works. You operate with an open heart, you can give and receive love. You operate with a closed heart, you can't receive love any more than you can give love. So forgiveness in Swahili has to do with the realization that is the opening of the heart in forgiving that allows you to be the recipient of love in return. Kalenjin went a phrase further. The Kalenjin people were nomadic pastoralists for thousands and thousands of years until Kenya got its independence in 1963. And in Kalenjin, you didn't meet people that often because you were nomadic pastoralists. So when you met people, there was a whole ritual of greeting that went on. And the ritual went like this. You said to somebody, Jamage. No, Jamage didn't mean just hi. Jamage literally means, do you love yourself? And the response was, Jamage. Yes, I love myself. And then you had to make sure, Jamage, man? Do you really love yourself? Jamage. Yes, I really love myself. And then you say, Jamage cuando? Does your wife love herself? Jamage cuando? Yes, my wife loves herself. Not do you love your wife, or does your wife love you, but does your wife love herself? Jamage cuando? Then, Jamage loge? Do your children love themselves? Jamage log. Yes, my children love themselves. And because they're cattle people, the final one was, Jamage toga? Do your cattle love themselves? And the response, Jamage toga. Now, the greeting then was making sure that everybody is at total peace with themselves. Now, the word they used for forgiveness in Kalenjin was Nyoiwan Gat, which literally means, come and ask me, do I love myself? Now, you want to know what forgiveness is? That's forgiveness in spades. Come and ask me, do I love myself? You're genuinely interested in how I'm feeling about me, about myself. Ask me, does my wife love herself? Ask me, do my kids love themselves? Ask me, do my cattle love themselves? So forgiveness in Kalenjin is this extraordinary insight that we don't have in English and we don't have in Irish. And the final phrase I want to pick up very quickly is this very strange phrase, both in English and you find it's in the Latin version as well. Lead us not into temptation. Now, what a very strange request to make of God. As if God, is this either trickster or sadist who wants to make life difficult for us. That's why God lead us into temptation. And it's the very same thing in the Latin. It says, ne nos inducas in tentationem. In other words, inducas is like to induct us or to seduce us or to lead us into. So do not lead us into sin. As if God is kind of, come on, you're quite safe, come here. And he's walking us into a minefield. Now, it's a really, really strange phrase. Why, who came up with that phrase? So, interesting, in Irish, we have a totally different line for this. In Irish, that phrase in Irish says, na lig sin I gahu. And literally, if I were to translate that, kahu is not temptation in Irish. Kahu is straits or difficulties. And na lig sin, it means do not allow us to wander into, or if we find ourselves there, do not allow us to stay in these straits. So this line in the Gaelic says, do not allow us to wander into difficult places, or if we find ourselves in difficult places, do not allow us to stay there. So it's a totally different idea than you get, in either Latin or in the English versions. So as you're moving from just in this one little prayer, as you're moving from language to language, different, cultures have different hits on different parts of the prayer. And to finish up with, I just want to look at the prayer then in toto. And it consists of 2 sections, and there are 7 kind of invocations, 3 in the first part and 4 in the second part. So you start off by addressing it to whoever, either a father figure or a birthing principle of the cosmos who resides in heaven, someplace up there. And there's 7 statements you make then in Matthew's version. And that is, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. They're the first 3 of the first part. And they're all directed to God and God's will. And then the next 4 have to do with our needs. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So while you look at the prayer, it's the ideal formatting. Christ is saying, when you pray, the first thing you have to do is to totally align yourself with God. It's not about the self initially. It's about aligning with source. So you have to make sure you're in alignment with God's will, God's purpose, God's name. And only when you're in alignment can you ask meaningfully for what you want. If you're not in alignment, you're going to be a narcissist grabbing a whole bunch of stuff that you want. If you are in alignment, you realize that the purpose of even asking is that you have needs. And it's interesting, of the 4 needs mentioned, only one of them has to do with the physical resources we need. Give us this day our daily bread. Now, bread stands for all of the resources necessary for incarnation, for the physical body to survive. The next three have to do with the realization that we are spirits in space suits. And our primary needs are not physical needs. Our primary needs are spiritual needs, having to do with sin or getting lost or finding ourselves in difficulties. And this was the ideal model that Christ proposed for us. So ultimately then, when we look at language, what we see is that in some senses, the written word is important, and we take all kinds of intellectual appreciations of it, but it's not as important at all as the spoken word is. Because the spoken word not only has a cognitive import, but has a vibratory frequency that's addressing us at all these levels. So sound is much more important than just kind of a written text. But the greatest sound of all is the sound of silence. And that's the importance of meditation. So we'll open it up now to Margaret.
Would you repeat the last sentence? After
Okay.
silence. The greatest thing is silence.
Okay.
And then you said something and it kind of disappeared.
I wasn't listening. I'm serious. I wasn't listening. So let me see it more reconstruct. I think that was, yeah. I thought I ended there. Yeah. So I said that was the importance of meditation. Meditation is the silent communion with Source. So where prayer is either a verbalized connection with God, meditation is residing completely in the silence. Right. Thanks, Margaret. Right. Joanna.
I read a book that translated from the original Aramaic, and each phrase, there's a lot of interpretation in Aramaic, so each phrase can be interpreted a lot of different ways. And one of my favorite ones was for the forgiveness. It said, "Help us mend our heart's simple ties to others."
Beautiful.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
That was my
Yeah,
favorite.
that's beautiful. Is that by Neil Douglas Klotz? Was that the guy who translated?
It's the black, it's a small little book with a black on the cover with Jesus.
I know he's the expert in translating from Aramaic. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And so, this becomes so important for us to realize, we're living in a world of 5,000 different languages, 5,000 different cultures. And to pretend like we can impose, an American way of life, or an English-speaking way of life on other people's and understand their processes, we're destroying all kinds of insights. The more languages we kill, the more insights we're killing, the more perspectives on life that we're killing. So rather than suppressing languages or trying to colonially impose a culture on another people, it is to cross-fertilize these cultures and find what we can learn from each other. Because as I've attempted to demonstrate this morning, in a single prayer, the Our Father, using just 5 or 6 languages, you can see the extraordinary breadth of possibility that resides there. So having the courage to listen to other people's perspectives, particularly people who come from other cultures, and how they're doing life, what the difficulties are they experience, and what the solutions are that they've come up with. This is the key to world peace. Yeah.
I had one more thing.
Sure.
Also, I think certain people carry within their voices more universal healing. I had done a little bit of work with shamans from South America, and she said to me, "I heal with my voice."
Absolutely.
There's a certain timbre.
Absolutely.
And I think you have that too.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And so that's why I maintain that the spoken word is much more powerful than the written word, because the written word in some senses has been kind of boiled down to a kind of a blah, written thing that all of us can agree to. This is the meaning of that. But when you're speaking to somebody, you're picking up a whole bunch of information that you can't pick up in the written format. So I would say to my clients constantly in a therapeutic encounter, if there are 2 people sitting in a room, a therapist and a client, there are 4 different conversations going on right there. 4 different conversations. There's my intellect as the therapist connecting with the intellect of the client. The client is telling me information, I'm receiving that up here, and we think this is what the conversation is about. That's only one of the conversations. I'm picking up the body language and the vibrations that the client is giving out. I'm doing it unconsciously, I'm not aware. I'm trying to become aware and factor that in as well. But basically, I'm picking that unconsciously from the client's unconscious. That's the second conversation. The third conversation, they're picking up information from my body language and the energy that I'm putting off, and they're reading that at a conscious level. And the fourth conversation is the 2 unconsciouses are in dialogue with each other. So with 2 people, there are at least 4 conversations going on. And the spoken word, there's a volume to it, there's a pitch to it, there's an accent to it, there's a tonality to it, there's a cadence to it, and all of these things that we don't even have words for very often. We don't think they exist. All of these are effective, in creating an energetic dance between the two people. And so the most healing thing that's happening is the energetic dance that's happening between the two people. And sound is a great medium for conveying that kind of healing. Yeah. Ingrid.
I had an opportunity to channel an entity through Kevin Ryerson. He worked with that movie star, you guys know, Shirley MacLaine,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
Dr. Walter Semke.
Okay.
And I asked if we had a soul name when we get outside of our bodies, and he says, yes, we do. It's a sound, it's a tone, it's a frequency. And he says there's a place that you can go into the astral realms where there's a gigantic tuning fork, and you go before this gigantic tuning fork, and it sings and tones back your soul name. And I thought that was really interesting.
That's beautiful, Ingrid. That's beautiful. I mean, I've long believed that the last thing a soul does when it leaves the launching pad and is ready for incarnation, the soul sings the sacred name. That's the core of the being. And we come into the planet, and then we're given an identity tag because Mommy and Daddy went through a child's book and they picked it. Oh, I like the name, this particular. Let's give her this name. But that's not your name. Your name was the soul, was the song that your soul sang, listening to the tuning fork as you were coming in. Yeah.
And when I used to do the Lord's Prayer, and I really love your interpretation where you bring in the feminine, but in my youth, I always had this issue with that particular line, thy will be done.
Yes.
I thought, no, I know what I want. I know what's best for me. Don't worry about it. I'm going to do it my way.
Yes.
And as I've been going through my maturity, now I realize that's one of the most sacred invocations, is to allow God's will, Goddess's will, the universal intelligence, because that really is the ultimate MBO.
Absolutely.
So now I really do call on that.
Good for you, Laurie. Let me share you a story. Seamus and I have, she was actually a grand-aunt, but we called her Anne Mag, and she lived in a very remote part of Ireland called Connemara, and totally self-sufficient. She lived there with her unmarried son, Mike. They had a farm. They had their own farm animals, they had their own milk, they made their own butter, they grew their own potatoes, so they were totally self-sufficient. But the only source of light they had was either candles or little hurricane lamps. And in the 1960s, the Irish government created what was called the Rural Electrification Scheme, where they're trying to bring electricity to all the outlying areas. So there are these big poles marching across the countryside carrying electricity. So Anne Mag signed up for it. So the first summer holidays, we went up there afterwards, and there's this electric bulb hanging inside in the middle of the kitchen. And I said to her, Anne Mag, how do you like the electricity? And she says, oh, it is grand entirely. I do turn it on in the evening when I'm looking for the matches to light the candle. And that's what she did. She put on the light, and then she found a box of matches, she lit the candle, and she turned this off because this could be costing money. So there she is with electricity, and she's depending on the candle. And that's us. We're in a universe that's created 250 billion galaxies, and still we want to impose our little way on how God is going to give us our needs, instead of, as you say, the MBO, the most benevolent outcome. Brilliant. Georgie.
Two things, very different. One is, I was a family law attorney, and one thing I learned, and through a class also, is that an inflection of a voice can make words mean totally different things. Totally different things. The other thing is, I spent 7 days in silence at a retreat, and it was amazing. After 3 days, I started being aware of things that I'd never been aware of before, and I was really surprised about that. But just learning things that I didn't know.
That's brilliant, George. My reaction when I heard you saying about the inflection of the voice, absolutely right. If I comment on what you said and I said right, or if I said right, right? So I'm giving you a totally different impression, just the same word. So the inflection is just totally. About the silence piece, that it's amazing that the healing sounds are typically very, very, very low volume. So if we're making so much noise that we can't hear the healing sounds, it means healing isn't happening because we're not resonant with it. So that's why when you go into silence for several days, what's actually happening is you're beginning to hear the healing sound level that you're not aware of because there's so much cacophony in the environment. I was living over in Waverley Street in Menlo Park for about 12 years, just off Middlefield. And when I would meditate at night, I'd sit down, I'd try to go silent, and the first thing I became aware of was the sound of the traffic out in Middlefield. I didn't hear it when I was so busy, and now that I'm going silent, I'm hearing the sound of the traffic. Get to about midnight, and the traffic is pretty much stopped. And now I become aware of the refrigerator. Every 15 minutes, the refrigerator. And then it does its thing for 10 minutes, and then there's other silence. And you drop down to a different level of silence. You go out into the forest where there's no machinery whatsoever, and after a while, you begin to hear things you've never heard before because you've kicked all the cacophony and all the external noise out of it. So going into silence on a regular basis is the way to be attuned to the healing energies. Great point, George. Brilliant. I think Alfred was next, and then Carolyn.
So this morning you dwelt on the beautiful word, I'll call it. Could you comment upon lying?
Lying.
The perversion of language.
Brilliant. Great question. A comment on lying. So, we think that lying, that the basic sin of lying is that you're trading in misinformation or disinformation, but that's only parenthetical. That's only a kind of a side effect. The biggest problem with lying is that to lie, you have to disempower yourself. Because if I have to tell a lie, it means that I'm not okay with who I am, I'm not okay with my truth, so I have to pretend to be somebody that I'm actually not. So the greatest devastation, the greatest damage done by lying as an individual or as a culture is that I have to disempower myself and move into a space which is not really me and operate from that. And we do this as a culture. All of fake news, all of propaganda is simply as a culture refusing to be who we are and operating from who we are. So the fact that we disseminate false information or propaganda, that's only a secondary effect of it. The real deep thing is that we have moved out of the soul, center of soul, who I really, really am, into a space that I'm trying to be, but I'm not. Yeah. I think Carolyn was next here, and then Karen, and then Bill. Go, Carolyn.
Well, this is back to the verbal communication. In this day and age of computers and texting and everything, how can we know what anyone is really saying? Unless maybe we italicize or put underlines where we want to accent.
Right. Totally.
And yeah.
Good.
Okay.
That's a great point, Caroline. So it's part of the difficulty, that how do human relationships develop or atrophy in the absence of face-to-face encounters? Because as well as the fact that you're trading, sounds with each other, you're also trading energies with each other. When you're in the same physical space as somebody else, there's literally your auras are dancing together and the energies are commingling. So you separate out the energetic dance and you separate out the sound and the harmonies that create this, and you're relying only on written text. You're totally impoverishing the conversation and you're totally impoverishing the relationship. And we're going to pay. There'll be a price to be paid for those two. Yeah,
just one other thing.
Sure.
One other thing. Sure. I'm totally alarmed now at the idea where our diplomats go to other countries and then someone translates.
Yes.
This translation is really scary. It may not
totally
be accurate.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Totally.
Thank you.
Absolutely. There's a huge difficulty in trying to translate from one to the other, unless the person is totally soaked in both cultures. And Carl Jung had a phrase for that. He called it Gnostic intermediaries. A Gnostic intermediary is somebody who's totally au fait, totally marinated in two different cultures, and is able to cross-fertilize them to their mutual benefit, where it takes a lot of time to achieve that level of enculturation before you can really communicate the soul and the wisdom of one culture to another. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Translation is very, very dicey. So Karen was next, and then it was Bill, and then and Joey after that.
So when you were talking about mothers and babies and lullabies, so when I was taking care of Ari for the month of February, there were lots of situations where I mean, there are the standard lullabies of, in different languages and all kinds of wonderful things, but there's the time when you are just singing and making sounds that are not those things. And it's this kind of, what you were just talking about, is this exchange that's going on from what he's saying and what I'm saying. And what was remarkable to me after days and days and days of this, is that I could not remember any of those particular lullabies.
Right.
Because they were just in that moment,
Totally.
and a combination of what was going on with the two of us.
Absolutely.
And I thought, gosh, is something wrong with my memory or what? They have so many variations that it's quite remarkable.
That's absolutely right. I imagine,
Yeah.
I'm not a musician at all, but I imagine that, when musicians get together to jam,
Yeah.
and there's no kind of score, they're just feeding off each other, and they do it in 3 weeks' time, it's a totally different experience. Because it's like the souls dancing with each other, and there's no
Exactly.
script, and you're not committing it to memory. It's not an intellectual exercise anymore. It's the two souls just, dancing spontaneously with each other.
Could I say
Sure,
one more thing,
sure.
if there's time? So when you were talking about the give us this day our daily bread as the only kind of physical thing, so I thought of that as kind of the bottom of a V,
Yes.
and was thinking about the fact that the things on either side kind of match up when we say, forgive us our sins.
Right.
So there's this notion of you can't do God's will
Yes.
if you don't have forgiveness.
Exactly.
And if you can lead us not into temptation, is where we've forgotten
Right.
what our name is.
Totally.
And it kind of pairs up with hallowed be thy name.
Right.
And you get to the end where it says, lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil.
Right.
And it pairs up with heaven.
Totally.
And so
Right.
it's a
That's
really
beautiful.
kind of interesting
That's beautiful. Right.
parallel
It's
of
beautiful.
what we're asking for.
Yes. Beautiful.
Yeah.
And it comes out of the Hebrew tradition of poetry. In Western poetry, very often, if you've got 5 lines of a poem, you're building, up to the punchline is going to be line 5, very, very typically. In Hebrew poetry, it's very different. It's you circle in to the core, or the middle line is actually the punchline. So you don't know what the punchline is until you've finished the entire poem, calculated the number of lines, and then gone back. And so, give you an example. If you have a 5-line poem in Hebrew, it's called Hebrew parallelism. So line 1 and line 5 will be very, very similar to each other. Line 2 and line 4 will be very similar to each other, and line 3 will be the focal point. It'll be the punchline. But you're going to have to cycle into it. You have to go from 1 to 5 to 2 to 4 to 3 to get the punchline. So you don't know what the punchline is until the end, and you've calculated. And that's part of the art of Semitic poetry. So you're absolutely right. So Jesus, obviously versed in Hebrew poetry, is using that system, and as he gives us the Our Father. So it's a beautiful insight, brilliantly. So Bill Miller was next, and then we're going to go to Joey.
Back on the earlier topic of lying, just there's so much division in this country at the moment, and in one camp it's easy to dismiss the other camp as, oh, they're just a bunch of liars, but kind of in the light of your earlier point about words creating reality, I wonder if, just for example, with global warming being a hoax,
Yes.
Obviously people in the coal industry would probably like to propagate that with the intent to deceive, but I wonder if some other people just aren't in the mindset that, if enough of us insist that it's a hoax, then it will be a hoax.
Right. It's very important. Words have extraordinary power to create reality, and obviously I would say when I was doing counselling, I had 10 basic tricks for good communication that I would work with each couple. And so one of them was to not be attached to an outcome, to go into every kind of dialogue open to the fact, open to the possibility that I might actually learn something from the other person. So if I go into a conversation, and even if I'm 90% right, and you're only 10% right, but I insist on imposing mine on yours, I haven't grown at all. If I sit back and I learn from you, I've increased my knowledge. I'm 10% wiser than I was, So if you choose not to listen to me, you're not any more wiser. But so instead of going into a conversation with a viewpoint that I'm going to impose on the other person, the realization that the other person is intelligent, they've had life experiences, and their experiences have some dimension of truth that I can benefit from and learn from. So let me see if I can pick up on that piece of it. And if they're open to the same possibility from their end, then both of us grow. Otherwise, it's just a battle of the two people trying to impose their system on each other. Great point, Bill. Joey.
Hi. So I've been taking a philosophy class at my school.
Great.
And we touched on the idea of language, and we were debating it and going over it.
Okay.
And one of the big ideas that I'd like to get your take on, Seán, is the idea that language is restricting us from finding the truth or understanding our universe. And what is language? Is language baiting us from getting there? Does that make sense?
That's a brilliant idea. And I would say, off the top of my head, yes, but I will qualify it a little bit. So I am a big believer that there's a great story, I think it's in around chapter 11 in the book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel. And the story allegedly is that human beings were trying to build a tower to reach the heavens. And the gods got really upset. And the gods came down and they confused human tongues. So they broke up, people couldn't understand each other anymore. So they broke it up into a whole bunch of languages. My belief system is that what happened really was that they gave us language, that's what confused us. And that before that, we had telepathic abilities. So when you're trying to explain your viewpoint to me, Joey, and I'm trying to explain my viewpoint to you, I'm having to use words, and the words aren't really capturing what I want to say, and maybe the words you're using aren't capturing what you really mean. But if our two minds were synced up telepathically, you could literally download your idea into my mind, and I could download my idea into your mind. But when we try to use language in order to kind of trade, mindsets, a whole bunch of stuff falls out. So I would agree with your philosophical thesis that language actually totally constricts it. But it's constricted further than when you put it on in paper and you write it down in a written format, you've lost a whole lot more. And so being with people and open to their energy, living with them, is the best way of all of understanding them. More importantly than what they say to you is, the energies you're picking up in the household, you're living there with your brother and your mother and your father. You're learning a lot more by being with your parents and your brother than you are by what they tell you or what they say to you or what they, believe about life. So I would agree with you. Language completely limits the ability, to communicate and to understand our universe. So you look, at the night sky. You look, for instance, at a sunset, and I guarantee you that even if you used 100,000 words, you could not totally express what your experience of the sunset is, no matter how you try to do it. There'll be parts you can't get, because you have the experience, a part of you knows the totality of it, but you can't put that piece in words, so it's going to shut us down. So I agree totally. Language closes us down. So Chris was next, and then Karen, and then
Can I ask you just one more thing going off of that?
Yeah.
Do you think, this is kind of going on a little bit more darker scale, but do you think language could be the human race's demise or fate? Because I think it was Carolyn that was talking about text messages, and we're so going towards more of an era of where we're just texting and not even having face-to-face conversations, and it's happening more and more. Do you think that could be really bad?
I think it could be really bad, Joey, because I think it's one of the stages on the road to artificial intelligence. The people who talk about artificial intelligence, there are 4 ways in which evolution can proceed right now, of the human species. The first way is natural evolution. We're taller now than people were 100 years ago. We have much more information now than people had in Shakespeare's time. So there's a natural evolutionary trajectory. Left to our own devices, it'll happen slowly. That's one way. The second way will be, medically or, surgically enhanced abilities. So, for instance, people have, your mother's an expert here, cochlear implants. People who have difficulty hearing, we can assist them, by cochlear implant. We assist people with, putting pacemakers in their hearts. So we can assist them physiologically by some kind of surgical processes. If you had the ability to implant a chip in your brain, tiny chip, that would allow you to never forget anything you've experienced, would you sign up for that? Or if you could do some kind of corrective surgery on your eye where you would have night vision. You'd be able to see just like a dog sees or a cat sees at night. Would you sign up for that? So the second stream of evolution is going to be surgically or medically or kind of engineered, evolution. The third one will be some kind of cloning, where they attempt to take a human mind and download it, into another version. So that if Seán ÓLaoire driving home today is in a car accident and I get killed, but they've downloaded my brain into 4 more copies of me, and they just animate one of the other copies, so there's just another version. Next Sunday is Seán ÓLaoire, but in a different spacesuit down here, right? That's the third way. And the fourth way is strict artificial intelligence, just machines who have passed the Turing test. The Turing test was a famous British mathematician, who said at some stage there'll be a test. You get on the phone with somebody, and at the end of the phone call, you're asked, were you speaking with a robot or were you speaking with a real human being? And when you can no longer tell the difference, then they've passed the Turing test. There's an artificial intelligence which is every bit as bright as humans. So there are the 4 roads we're going down. Now, which one are we going to choose, Joey? That's the question. The more we rely on technology, whether it's texting or computers, instead of face-to-face encounters, the more likely it is that we're going to choose 2, 3, or 4, and more likely 3 and 4, and maybe most likely of all, number 4. So we have choices to make. These are huge ethical dilemmas that we face as a species. What is the future? It may well be that Homo sapiens sapiens has run its course, and we have reached an evolutionary dead end. Many, many other species before Neanderthals died out. Neanderthals had 10% bigger brains than Homo sapiens sapiens, but they died out. Many, many different life forms have reached evolutionary cul-de-sacs. The question is, will Homo sapiens sapiens reach an evolutionary cul-de-sac, and will the baton be handed on to some form of artificial intelligence? And if it is, will those artificial intelligence have souls? Well, you didn't ask this question, but I just answer this one big thing. I think yes. I mean, when a soul decides to have an experience, it may decide to have an experience as a rock. It may decide to have an experience as a plant. It may decide to have an experience as a banana slug. It may decide to have an experience as a kitty cat. It may decide to have an experience as a human being. Why couldn't a soul decide to have an experience within a robot? If it's an experience of interfacing with life, why wouldn't it choose that? Because the soul itself, which is not the robot any more than it is the banana slug or is the human being, could choose to learn in this modality. So no matter what road we take, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't interfere with the soul. The soul is who we really, really are. So that was 2 great questions, Joey. Thanks for asking that. So Patricia was next, and then Karen. Who was there? Oh, Chris. Sorry, Chris was next. Chris.
Yeah, just a couple of things I wanted to share. On the subject that was brought up earlier on silence, I may have shared this before, but it just reminds me of a quote by a Benedictine monk who said, "The language of God is silence. Everything else is a mistranslation."
That's brilliant, Chris.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
And the other thing is I wanted to share was on translations. I had a friend that was frustrated because he was trying to get an exact translation from Sanskrit. Specifically, I think it was with the Bhagavad Gita. And he kept getting different translations, and so he decided to do his own. And what he discovered was, and this is the example he gave, he said it's like, the original saying was, it was like apples are a healthy food. And he said what the translations would come out with would be like, you need to eat apples to be healthy, or you'll never be healthy if you don't eat apples, or the only way you can ever experience health and healing is to eat apples, or it could be, we're all doomed if we don't have apples. So, anyway, it's just
that's brilliant, Chris. Awesome stuff, buddy. I think we're at 11:05. 11. So we'll take 2 last questions. We'll take Patricia and then. Okay. No. Right. So 3 last questions. Go.
Okay, this is rather short. I had one comment, but I'll let that one go for another time. We're talking about texting and, written word in a lot of ways, but particularly trying to communicate with written word by letters even. It's more difficult to communicate an emotion through that. And I mean, like, an emotion could be translated in poem, and whoever's really good with words could make that, they could translate it, I mean, they could communicate it better than other people. But I was just paying attention about the new stage of texting is emojis.
Yes.
And I think they're being used because people are finding they can't really communicate beyond the words, and they can be so misinterpreted.
Right. Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. So emojis, so Lawrence, and then, start, right. And then Lawrence, we'll get the last word to you, Lawrence.
I've been having a little difficulty with the distinction between words, language, and telepathy, because I feel like telepathy. I mean, when I talk to spirit, like I've been talking frequently with my sister. Not that I asked her to maybe leave a little sign for me, just a connection, and I got it very quickly. But that's beside the point. But the thing is, when I'm talking, usually I'm just thinking the words, but that's still words. Yes. and verbal concepts. And when I thought about animals, and I'm often awed at it. I don't seem to hear all these. They're just various different sounds, but they don't seem like words, but yet they understand a lot of different things between each other, and it seems like they understand more about what we're saying than we understand about them.
Okay, great question. So what's happening is when we're thinking in our heads, we're operating from what Saussure called the signified, and then we're using signifiers to communicate that. But we think then telepathy is about taking the signified, which is just other images in our head, and translating them. So there's a difference between putting words to what's signified and the signified itself. So when you have an encounter in East Africa with a giraffe, the encounter is not contained in words. But as you try to manipulate the images in your head, you're going to use words to try to grok it. But if you could download the images you're having, the sense of smell, of taste, of sound, of visual, if you could download that, that would be true telepathy. So if all you're doing is you're trying to communicate the internal words to somebody else's brain, you're not dealing with, that's not really telepathy. That's the kind of the words associated with the images being translated and communicated rather than the entire package getting downloaded to the other. So we'll finish with Lawrence. Lawrence.
So I have a question and a comment, and I'll ask the question first and then comment, which is, what do you recommend in terms of trying to understand different parts of holy text, different sayings of Jesus? I have the good fortune to pick readings where I'm always trying to look at, like today's reading from Paul, comparing the King James with charity, the version of love. King James does have the beautiful through a glass darkly phrase, but that's sort of confusing. I use different alternative English translations. There's a great site, BibleGateway.com, where you can just put multiple translations on the screen and say, which one do I want? I pick a particular sort of more modern translation for most things. But what do you recommend for Englishmen like myself who only speak one language and cannot translate between Swahili, Irish,
do a course in Irish and
Aramaic?
Swahili. That's a great question, Lawrence. You're absolutely right. So I think you've discovered something really brilliant for yourself. By just looking at a whole bunch of different English translations, you begin to see, firstly, the differences that are contained there. And then what you're doing, obviously, then, you're measuring the translations against some kind of inner resonance. What's appealing to your heart? What's giving the message that you think needs to be communicated to this community on a Sunday morning. And you're doing a brilliant job in it, let me add. You're picking brilliant readings. So that's the first thing you're doing really brilliantly. Now, what do you do about what resonates with you, Lawrence Bird, as you're looking at these different translations? That's based upon your life experiences, how much you're in contact with your soul, how much you're operating out of love rather than out of fear or kind of anxiety or whatever. And so to the extent that you're operating out of real deep love, you're going to pick translations that, that suggest that to the rest of us. So I would say some kind of a practice of meditation where you're really, in relationship, in a strong relationship with your soul self. Long before there was a Lawrence Bird, there was a soul that incarnated as Lawrence Bird. So how do you nurture that connection between Lawrence Bird and that soul so that you're operating more and more and more out of pure love? And then when that pure love meets a variety of texts, it's going to resonate with the one that's most loving and that we need to hear at COJ on the Sunday mornings. So I want to thank you for that job, this extraordinary job that you do week after week for us. So thanks a million, guys. A million. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.